show, everybody. You know what? I've decided excited to talk all the time. Pretty much excited for every show. But this one in particular, I think is super special because of all the nuance that this conversation needs, but unfortunately isn't having, especially like in the public eye. So today's episode is about cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. Is there a difference? What does that difference look like? And why, as Americans, it's so deep-rooted in society and life? So, first and foremost, cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. Is there a difference, and what's your opinion on it?
I think we all agree that like cultural quarantines is not the solution. Right, and from a perspective of
cultural quarantines. Let's get it.
Yes, that's certainly not the solution, right?
Yeah.
And I think we can all agree that there's a value in diversity.
Yes.
Right. And if colonialism relies on like dividing people, right? Like we all agree we need to be together, right? Yeah. And I think we also know when somebody is clearly doing something that is being disingenuous with the cultural artifact.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, don't tell me that you went to a frat party and you painted your face black and it didn't occur to you that that's not a thing that you should be doing. Right?
Yes.
Like, don't tell me that. Like,
Period.
You don't need to do that, right? And so I think, if there's a spectrum of things that are appropriate, I think that a reasonable standard is just to like actually honor the culture, right? It's not me that said this, but it's somebody that did, whose name I forgot right now.
Someone smart said something.
No. But if you value the humanity as much as you value the cultural artifact, then that's where you want to be, right? Like value the person. Like if we valued people of color the way that we value their sneakers, then I don't know that everybody would be as upset. I'll start there and pass it on, but
that's good.
Yeah.
I like to keep it really simple with an idea of celebration versus an idea of theft. I'm taking something and I'm trying to make it my own and pretend that it's mine and it's mine originally and I'm just doing this because of me versus I'm doing something like even the shoes I'm wearing right now could be considered a level of appropriation, but to me, I like red, I like sneakers, I have a company called Red Suede Shoes. I'm celebrating that these are beautiful. This is part of who I am, but that doesn't mean I don't know that there's a culture behind it. So when I walk in these shoes, I'm not just walking around thinking I'm the shit because of it. There's a level of appreciation that comes to that. But you have to be aware to think that way. And I think that's a matter of exposure and understanding of the people around you and learning to hear stories and being curious. I think at the core it's about the curiosity of where do all these different cultural attributes come from or cultural phenomenon or style points or different things that we're looking at or artifacts, etc. And how are we then learning the history? How are we learning how this became to what it is and where did it get started and how do I participate with this now in my life and with the people around me?
Facts. That's good. That's facts.
Oh, man, both those answers.
Yes.
I think the biggest thing is just not criminalizing cultural differences and not like dehumanizing them, like you were saying, like make sure to appreciate the human as much. I remember being young and going to a friend of mine's house who was from a completely different culture, and I remember coming home and I was like, oh yeah, their house smelled weird. And my parents like sat me down and they were like, no, their house doesn't smell weird. I was like, yeah, it smelled weird. And they're like, no, it smells different because there's a food amongst their culture that they eat. And when they cook that food, it has a strong smell and that's how their home smells. But it doesn't smell weird, it just smells different.
It's weird to you because you haven't seen it before,
Exactly.
but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing.
Yeah,
and that's where the weird word as a kid or the words that we choose to describe things are really important.
And so like
as a child, sorry to piggyback again.
But
like
great.
if no one then like if your parents didn't challenge your thought at that moment, you just walk around automatically from a child, not demonizing but otherizing folks.
Exactly.
You're just like, oh well, that's just strange. I don't mess with that. Instead of being challenged, being like, hey, it's just different and different is totally acceptable.
Which eventually leads to being demonized, I think.
Yes.
Because I think we start to go, oh, like that's weird. I don't understand that. That's not normal. It's so easy to slide that into the category of, well, that's completely out of order. That's wrong. That's shouldn't be allowed. That's illegal, et cetera, you know? So I think, just like having the same appreciation for a culture that you have for your own and understanding that different isn't wrong. It's just different.
I like what you said about that's not normal, but it's normal to be different. And normalizing the fact that there are differences is where we have the biggest opportunity to engage with our young people and share the different levels of culture and share the different levels of appreciation of that and say, you know, there's always going to be something different, but not everybody's exposed to that at a young age. I mean, here in Chicago, it's a lot easier. There's a lot of different cultures present, but in other areas of the world, or of this country, or even of this state, there's pockets of people that only look like each other. So I think that's where we find ourselves in rooms like this, in conversations like this, and understanding that a lot of people have not had that exposure, have not had that learning opportunity. Their parents never had to have that conversation because every house they went in smelled the same. So they didn't have that opportunity to learn it at a young age. So then when you get older and you have instances where you come up against culture and you don't know how to interact with it, you're not always going to get it right on the first time. So there's a level of forgiveness and understanding and growth that everybody has to have with each other, because it is not always intentional, even if it comes off as like a real shitty thing to do or a real shitty way to act.
It's so, I mean, I said this before, but it's so important to be able to have an honest conversation about your discomfort interacting with, or depicting, or describing, whether it's like face to face or with somebody you love or somebody else you know, like people that are different than you. You have to be comfortable having that conversation, or you're not going to make any progress or learn anything. And there are models for honoring cultural artifacts, right? Like if you are a fashion designer and you want to like take certain elements from a culture in Africa, right? Then get out there, right? I mean, this has been done before. Like go out there, be in the community, have a conversation with them. And like if you want to have an element of financial attribution too, like no one's going to be mad at that either, right? Like if you want like a royalty arrangement, do that too. Why not, right?
I mean, I would say that's almost essential, to be honest.
Go ahead.
I would say it's essential to some degree.
Go ahead and tell me that. Okay.
Because the big thing I feel like in reference to cultural appropriation, and the reason why it's not just such a buzzword, but it's literally embedded in the DNA of America. And I'm not sure if cultural appropriation is something that's discussed in any other country, but here we as, I don't want to say as Americans, but in general, overall history class, like for example, somebody brought up to me, why did it take Michelle Obama to happen to tell me that the White House was built by slaves? Like history books like to leave those things out. For example, Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's no, that's a trash. Like, come on. Like the food is popping, but the real thing was like, the Pilgrims were starving, didn't know what to harvest. The Indians taught them how, the Native Americans taught them how to harvest corn.
Squanto with the fish.
Yes.
You always see the picture, he's got the fish, taught him like,
And then we wipe y'all out. And it's just like, but we don't talk about that. So I think the real, I don't want to say like dissonance, but the reason why it's such a flashpoint in society, and I know that I can speak for myself, is it's all about being acknowledged. It's like far too often we talk about like culture vultures, this, that, and the third, and granted we'll expand on that term in a minute, but it's the acknowledgement, and similar to the way you guys both characterize, like understanding that it comes from something, and understanding that in America especially, if your skin is white, you need to be extremely mindful of where these things come from. Do not try to claim things as own. I remember this one time, I was living in New York, and there was some article when they was talking about how they went to Harlem or they went to the Bronx and they had a chopped cheeseburger, and they were just like, oh man, this is so, and folks was like, we've been doing chopped cheeses up here for forever. Like we can't be out here doing that. With the Kardashians and the cornrows or the
like when someone discovers
boxer braids.
Like,
come on, man.
Like when someone's like, yo, I discovered street corn. It's like, wait, you mean
elote?
Like, come on now. Like, what you talking about? You know what I mean? It's like,
And like, I guess to be succinct, because clearly we're all on the same wave in reference to that. It's just being mindful of where things come from, especially if your skin is white. That's the real conversation. Actually, I'd like to open that up to you guys from the standpoint of, do you think it's possible for the marginalized to culturally appropriate?
Yes, but it's called assimilation.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
And it's complicated because it's what was expected. And that's why it's something that is not talked about in the same way. And code switching and having to deal with rooms of being around people that completely don't look like you and trying to fit in to the culture of the workplace that people like you haven't always been in. People that look like me haven't always been in them. So as a woman, there's a level of that happens too.
Sure.
But it's complicated because it exists, but it's because it was expected for years that it's not the same type of conversation. It was a pressure to do this versus a celebration of let's all come together and there's things that everybody should recognize in that process. Yeah.
That's a very, very valid point.
Wow.
I think the thing that I love that you hit square on the head, and I wasn't necessarily thinking about, but you're right. Like, it is called assimilation. It's when the marginalized do it, it's because it's expected that you fit into this culture in order for you to ascend and do and like just essentially self-actualize. I think that's fascinating.
I think it comes from this overarching concept that value only comes when something that is from a marginalized community gets in the hands of someone who's from the community in power. So I think when you look at like assimilation, it's like if you're marginalized, your value comes from having as close a proximity as possible to the community in power. So it's like you have to throw off everything that you can identify with as a culture, everything that makes you who you are. Don't speak a certain way, don't dress a certain way, make sure to do your hair a certain way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then as soon as you get as close as you can to the culture in power, now you have value. Same thing with anything that comes from that culture. Well, in that culture in and of itself, it's seen as weird, devalued, criminalized, like ghetto, whatever you want to call it. But then once it gets in the hands of dominant culture, now it has value. Now you can make it into $1 billion industry. Now you can do all these things with it. So I think that overarching concept is where like assimilation and even like appropriation come from, is this idea that like, this is invaluable until the person who holds it has value in society, and then they make it valuable.
There's a recent statement, Benedict Cumberbatch, I probably butchered how to pronounce his last name. Cumberbatch just declared that he will not sign on to any movie project that his female counterpart, co-star, is not paid the same as he is. So my statement to share that now is because you can't just walk in making noise and expect people to hear you. And you can't just walk in saying, I created this, I did this. It's about, and there's a level of meritocracy, earning your place and earning your voice at that table. And once you get there, then you can start to show yourself. Then you can start to be a little bit more comfortable. Then you can start fighting to bring other people to the table with you. But you have to have the ability to get that spot at the table. People have to hear you first. And that's where the more hip hop culture was celebrated, the more we see people coming through the ranks and everybody like, wait, this is actually cool. Oh, well, now I can talk to this person who before I thought was different, so I wasn't supposed to talk to them, but it's accepted in different ways. So even if you always know in your heart of hearts that it's right to celebrate everyone, there's a level of permission that's given by that value that you get, and you have to work for that. Like every single person, like as a woman, as a CEO, as someone who started my own business and been in rooms and at the board tables where people turn to me and say, can you take notes or can you get me a coffee? I'm like, no, I earned my spot here. Like, you can get your own coffee. But I had to get there in order to be able to say that and laugh about it with them. So there's like that level of finding your value, finding your voice, and then creating the value for those that helped create it or are part of that, whatever that piece of culture is.
It is a nuanced issue, but let's not ignore the fact that there are many, many people that are willfully ignorant of cultural appropriation. Right? I have no idea how many of the people in the world that is, because I don't have the data for that. But
that's a hard data point. Excuse me.
No, really. But
are you a bad?
Are you intentionally unaware?
Right. Really though. But you know what? But it's also not that hard of a thing to trust your intuition sometimes, right? Like I don't want to shy away from instances in which I can tell that somebody is wearing a costume. A
poser.
And I think that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about appropriation, like really violent appropriation, as opposed to like, all right, cool, I kind of care about this community and I'm going to do a little research, and there's like a spectrum of things that we can talk about of the right way to go about that. But there's a whole nother group on the other end of the spectrum that's like
just trying to make money off of other people's backs.
Yes.
But I think some of that comes from in the way that people learn about appropriation or even appropriation phases, because like the reality is like we all go through phases throughout the time I'm like being mature, especially throughout high school, right? You meet some kids like, I had like a goth phase, or I had like an emo phase, I had a hood phase, I had a preppy phase, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Now when those phases happen, people are often told like, hey, it's just a phase. But something that isn't talked about is in this phase, you aren't actually becoming a part of this community. You aren't actually understanding this community. You're just trying it on for this time, and it doesn't mean that you can fully kind of identify with it. I think the problem is that people are taught that, in this phase, you understand everything about it, which is why you can have a conversation with someone who's like, oh yeah, when I was in high school, I used to dress like, real black, and I used to listen to hip hop, so I understand everything the black community goes through. And it's like, how is that possible? Like, I understand, like, you listen like to Lil White most likely, and like maybe like maybe like some like Juvenile here and there, but it doesn't mean that you fully that you fully understand it. But it's phrased as this is the phase you're going through where you're actually like consuming and understanding culture as opposed to just taking kind of this like stereotypical ride through culture.
I will say something that's actually interesting about that, and I'm happy that you brought up that point, that cultural appropriation kind of happens on the spectrum, and there's allies, there's people that are actually thinking that they're not being appropriators.
Oh, yeah.
But that whole entire concept of, I used to go through this phase, or I have black friends, folks who say that really, I don't want to say they mean well, but like they really think in some shape, way or form, they are better informed, hopefully, because they have black friends, because they are a bit closer to the culture. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily give you like the air to say you understand completely. I think everybody's not equipped to have such conversations. And I think that's the part that's kind of like, I don't want to say like tricky and or scary, but like people want to be involved, but then they're like, oh, and there's that whole, so I'm not a cultural appropriator, I'm an ally, which is like a more positive way to go about like, I kind of get it and I'm still learning, but there's still a lot of nuance and semantics that goes along with that. But I think that's actually pretty fascinating, because it's one of those things of like, and I think the thing that's fascinating is, I don't go around trying to claim that I fully understand someone else's experience. And I think that's when it becomes a problem. And this is not just talking about people that want to benefit and profit off of like cultures that aren't theirs, but people who actually care, but think that they go about it in this way in which like, no, like you really don't understand how, like you can't explain generational trauma to people. You
can't validate that by having one black friend.
Like that's just not one of those things where like, oh, like no, it's much more nuanced than that. And I think that's an interesting conversation and an interesting point to bring up, just because it just adds a bit more context. So it adds a very real layer that people of which aren't on this side might miss.
Like the black friend trope is so funny, right? Because when people ask me honestly, why would you care about this, or why are you working at the school that you're working in? Like the honest answer, the genesis of it all is because I had black friends, right? Like that's the actual answer, right?
And that's okay.
Like the answer is
that's a good answer
in that context, right? But I think even outside of my particular context, like the point still is that like a black friend or a cultural artifact from a certain community is an access point for people to at least begin engaging with the community. So even though I understand a reaction to people that don't do it honorably, earnestly, and with humility, like it is a starting point, right? But like we do have to give people a way to do it that honors the where it came from.
And I think what happens sometimes is like people are cut out when they try to do that by just the label of being like an appropriator, and it's like, well, you're an appropriator, you're completely cut out now. You know what I mean? Like I think about when you see like white kids with dreads, and someone just comes up like, you're appropriating. You're appropriating. And it's like, okay, well, first off, you ain't even like from any sort of Caribbean, nothing.
Like you ain't Rasta.
Right? You ain't like, so I'm not 100% sure. But anyways, so you're telling me that I am, how can I participate in this? And it's like, well, you can't. And it's like, well, there's gotta be a way. No, you just can't. And it's like, so it becomes this thing like, okay, so are we just, like, is that what we're talking about? Are we saying that it becomes a cultural quarantine, you know?
There were those two basketball players. There was one Asian player who got dreadlocks, and an African-American black player was like, you're cultural appropriating, and he was like, you literally have Asian tattoos, symbols on your arms. Like, how is this? Like, if you're gonna come at me, like, and do you know that means something different than you think it means? Like, so it's a level of not playing, like not trying to claim appropriation without actually understanding the whole situation around it. So through what you guys had talked about, it reminded me there's a community down in the South called Come Meet a Black Person. Has anybody heard of this?
No.
I have not.
Come on.
Okay.
This sounds great.
Come on, that's on the
I don't know if I want to
nose.
laugh or
This
not.
sounds-
Yeah, that's
So-
super on the nose.
Like,
So this is a
Black
community
I wonder how
that
much they paid. No, I'm just
has
playing.
literally been.
I wonder how much they get paid.
Sign me up. I'm ready.
brother, go,
Let's get that guap. Let's get that guap.
So it was started.
Oh my God.
It was started by in a community that's very segregated, and there was, a cross-cultural friendship that was created, and she was like, "Oh, before you, I'd never met a black person, so I didn't know anything about black people. I had no awareness."
Very real.
She was like, "Well, why don't we start this?" And now it's literally a group of black people and a group of white people that come together and just talk to each other. And I think that's where we're still trying to figure that out. It's 2019, and how many problems are started within cultural issues is because we haven't actually had a conversation with someone that doesn't look like us or isn't from that same background. Like, I know Nick and I know each other from my work with Forward, the For Women in Diversity community, and people ask, like, why are you a white woman working in diversity? Why did you start this? What was the story behind it? And I went to a public school in the south side of Chicago. I was never comfortable in a room where everyone looked like me. And that I was fortunate to have that from a young age. I was always in rooms that a lot of people look different, came from different backgrounds. But that was something, like, as an adult, I kept getting put in rooms where everybody looked like me, and I was like, well, this is stupid. How do we change that? That's why Forward was started, because professional inclusion has to actually include all different types of people, all different types of backgrounds. And in order to break that down, we need to talk to each other. We need to know that there's value on both sides of the table, and if you don't see a black executive or a black person in the boardroom, you can't, if you can't see it, you can't be it, you can't create it, you can't be a part of it. So it's like that whole kind of coming together of all of those moving pieces.
so true.
And that's why I thought that community was hilarious. But I'm like, this is true. Like,
They could have had a more sophisticated name.
well,
I think they
but
definitely
they just
could
were
have
honest.
involved.
Well, maybe they
Like,
nailed it.
I don't know, but like,
At least
why?
do like an acronym, like, you know
Yeah,
what I mean?
like,
hey,
But like,
hey, you
why
coming to
veil
CMPP
it though,
tonight?
right? Like, why veil it? Why try and create a brand out of something that you're literally just trying to create communication? And I've learned about it actually because there was some women covering it on a TV show. I think it was like Tia and Tamera and a couple. I don't know what this TV show is like. I just saw a clip on Facebook, and everybody was mad about it. They're like, "This is stupid. I can't believe this." And it was a lot of women of color. There were no white women on there, and I was like, "Well, this is a point of there's not all the voices at the table." And as a white woman, I know a lot of my white friends that have never really met or gotten to know a black person, and that's not
see it on the
necessarily
gram.
their fault. It's not like, what am I going to do? Walk down the street and be like, "Hi, you're black. I'd like to make a black friend. Will you talk to me?" Because that's inappropriate.
Also
so like,
true.
there's that gap. It's like, am I supposed to like seek out black friends? Yes and no, but there's a way to do it, and it's hard to make friends as adults, anyways. Now I got to figure out these other layers.